Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Briefing Room on Monday. I'm Devin Dwyer, our Deputy Political Director, Mary Alice Parks here. Great to have you with us. Hope you had a good weekend. A lot to get to today, Mary Alice. A roller coaster Monday on the global financial markets. Your 401k is doing some swinging today because a lot of concern about what the president is doing with China.
Yeah, some estimates this could be one of the sharpest Chinese stock falls in more than 3 years. Though the president has made threats like this before. We saw him taking to Twitter to talk about the possibility of more tariffs. But again, he's gone down that route and then pulled back. At some point, you have to wonder if these are empty threats.
Let's take a look at the markets right now. We have the live board. Well, here's the president's threat, actually, his tweet. This is what set everybody spinning for the past 10 months. China's been paying tariffs to the United States of 25% on high tech, 10% on $200 billion. The president there talking about raising them. The markets, well, they bouncing back a little bit this afternoon. They were down as many as 500 points this morning. Let's go to the White House now, where our Meredith McGraw, White House reporter, has been tracking this all weekend long. Meredith, what actually has happened here to send everybody's 401ks down on the swing today?
Hi, Devin. President Trump took Chinese and investors worldwide by surprise over the weekend when he reignited this ongoing trade war with China. And this is just days after the president said that trade talks with China were, quote, going well. Now, the president really dropped a bomb. Here's what he threatened yesterday. Tariffs on $200 billion of Chinese goods will be increased from 10% to 25% on Friday, and potentially another $325 billion of Chinese goods that remain untaxed could also be taxed at a rate of 25%. Now, the president blamed his decision on trade talks that have gone, quote, too slowly. And for months now, the Trump administration and Chinese have been locked in tough trade negotiations that really haven't gone anywhere. And there was, at least for a little while, a temporary freeze on the tit-for-tat of tariffs that roiled global markets. But last week, it really did seem like we were on the verge of a breakthrough. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin and U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer traveled all the way to Beijing for trade talks with China that they said were, quote, productive. And President Trump last month said that Chinese and U.S. were on the verge of a, quote, monumental deal. Now, even as the president's threats led some to believe these talks might be called off entirely, we're still expecting Chinese delegation to come to Washington on Wednesday. So for now, it's a wait and see on what will happen, even as investors are totally spooked.
Yeah, Meredith McGraw, thank you so much. Thanks for braving the vacuum cleaner there on the White House North Lawn.
It's a busy spring cleaning. It doesn't stop.
Maybe that's an ominous sign of these of what's to come in these trade talks. In all seriousness, a big Friday deadline ahead. Meredith, thank you so much. For more on the economic ramifications of all this, so let's bring in an economist now. Robert Scott is a senior economist, director of trade manufacturing policy at the Economic Policy Institute. Rob, it's great to see you. Thanks for Skyping in today. You once wrote an op-ed, I think about a year ago, where you said, don't sweat the tariffs. It's not going to be any big deal. They've been in place now for a while. The president's threatening to ramp them up. What do you make of the situation right now?
Well, what we've seen is that this is a repeated pattern from the president. He makes these threats when we're getting to the end stage of a game. Here we're trying to negotiate a deal. I think the president is trying to force the process forward. He really needs a deal with China to reassure markets that everything's going to be okay and the economy can continue growing.
It's hard to imagine that threats like this help going into a negotiation, but maybe I have it wrong. Is that the way to sit everyone down at the table, to go in with sort of your strongest foot forward?
I think it's not the diplomatic approach, certainly not what we've done in the past, but it's something that Trump has done. For example, he threatened repeatedly to impose tariffs on Mexico, to withdraw from the NAFTA agreement if he didn't get what he wanted out of those negotiations. Of course, they did come to conclusion here about a year ago. So we've seen this before.
And Rob, one of the things that's interesting about this moment as these negotiations come to yet another juncture this Friday with this deadline is that you have Republicans and Democrats, including Chuck Schumer, telling the president to stick it to China, be tough, stay tough. In fact, in the Chinese media today, we saw lots of caricatures of President Trump like a comic book villain over there because the markets have dropped so much. They're really feeling the pinch. Do you think this is sort of the most leverage the United States has ever had in a trade negotiation with China? I mean, is this a good thing at this point that we're at right now?
We certainly have issues that we had to address. There's tremendous amounts of theft of intellectual property. China has been manipulating its currency for close to 20 years now. This is its single most important advantage. And this gives it makes everything that it exports to the United States artificially cheap. It makes our exports to not just to China, but to the rest of the world more expensive than they need to be. And it's cost us millions of jobs. And this is the first time we've actually taken them on in a serious way. So I think it's important that we do this. The question is are we going to get a deal that's really worth it? Are we going to get any real benefits?
And if there were to be an all-out trade war where the floor just went out, would it hurt U.S. consumers in the end? There's a lot of talk that it would maybe hurt China more, but it's hard to imagine that U.S. consumers wouldn't also take a bruising.
I think it's true that consumers would pay the price. They already are. In one sense, the tariffs that we're paying on these Chinese imports are paid at the end of the day by U.S. consumers, not by Chinese exporters. I think that's important to be clear about. On the other hand, China has played its ace in the hole. It has lowered the value of its currency by nearly 10% since March of last year when these tariffs were imposed. And that has allowed it to lower the price of its exports. So at the end of the day, consumers aren't yet paying that much more in the U.S. So the U.S. is not that big a problem. In China, on the other hand, it is a problem. China is much more dependent on exports to the U.S. and the rest of the world than we are. It's about 0.5% of U.S. GDP for total exports to China. For China, it's probably at least 5 to 10% of their total gross domestic product. That's a much bigger risk for the Chinese economy.
And we'll see if the United States can, as President Trump would say, extract a better deal from the Chinese in the course of this because of that dynamic right now. Rob Scott with the Economic Policy Institute, thank you so much, sir, for coming in today. Shifting gears now to the clash between congressional Democrats and the White House over subpoenas, specifically involving the Attorney General of the United States and Congress today, talking about holding him in contempt. Let's bring in our two congressional reporters, crack reporters. Catherine Faulders is here, fresh off her reporting. Ben Siegel is here, who tracks the Judiciary Committee. Guys, great to see you. So what happened today? We saw that Jerry Nadler, Ben Siegel, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, threatening to hold the Attorney General in contempt.
Yeah, it's a bit hard to follow, but the crux of it is the Democrats want the report. They want the full Mueller report. There was some of that was redacted for various reasons when it first was released. The Democrats want to see all of it. The Attorney General has let them see it at the Justice Department. That's not good enough. So now they want the full report and are frustrated that the Attorney General is not giving it to them.
But the Justice Department is responding by saying that they had a chance to look at a slightly less redacted version and turn that down. So are either side negotiating in good faith here?
That's a great question, and of course they would both tell you that they are.
Yeah, right.
But I think there's reasons that they're both digging in. I think for Democrats, it's helping them. There's a lot of frustration in the party among members about what was found in the Mueller report, about how the Attorney General and this White House is dealing with Congress, and I think this is a way to bring them to heel, they think. And for the Trump administration, they're frustrated that this report has essentially cleared the president, and Democrats are still haranguing them over details and won't even come and see it.
Yeah.
So.
And Catherine, what's the significance of a contempt citation for someone like the Attorney General, for Congress to pass it, slap Bill Barr with it, and then threaten to hold other people in contempt, maybe even Robert Mueller if he doesn't show up?
Right. So Ben and I were talking about this earlier and parsing through these documents, this markup that they're going to hold on Wednesday to hold Barr in contempt. And I think the interesting part of this that Ben and I were finding is that it's a criminal referral, right, Ben? Mm-hmm. So then that means that was referred to the U.S. Attorney attorney in Washington, D.C., which is Bill Barr's own Justice Department. So where is that going to go? Is it going to look a lot like the same with Eric Holder when he was held in contempt? The same thing, Obama's Justice Department. So it's politically embarrassing, sure. You could view it that way, but at the same time, where will this go? It will be over a period of years, I'm sure, if this moves forward after Wednesday.
It feels like a ticking time bomb, though, this back and forth, this escalating dynamic between the two of them, between Jerry Nadler there in the Judiciary Committee and AG Barr. But where does it end? Is it, years and years and years dragged out in the courts, or is there more of a breaking point? Is there an explosive point?
I think this is sort of a real-life version of Schoolhouse Rock, where we're sort of figuring out what happens if somebody doesn't listen to Congress when they want information, and what happens when what can they do? And we're learning about the limits of some of those things that we read about in the history books, and I think it's anybody's guess as to where this goes. The short answer is probably the courts in some fashion, but we don't know what exactly that looks like, and also how long it could take. It could take many years, maybe after the president's out of office.
And you raise a good point, too, that this is only one piece of information that the House Democrats want. They'd like tax returns. They'd like more information from the agencies.
Testimony from White House officials.
Exactly. So we could see this kind of stonewall across the board.
The biggest figure that they want to hear from is Robert Mueller himself. In fact, Republicans do, too. No one has heard from Robert Mueller since he launched his investigation 2 years ago. Catherine, you've been doing some reporting on this today, but generally speaking, who gets to decide if Robert Mueller even shows up in Congress? What does that look like? Does he go willingly? What if he doesn't go? Can they compel him to come in?
Yeah, so there's all sorts of factors here, but if we're dealing with the president right now, Robert Mueller, who's still at the Department of Justice, and the committee, the Judiciary Committee, wants him to come before the committee. They say they've been negotiating with Mueller's representatives. Of course, those people are still at Justice over a day to bring him in. They say that they want him there May 15th. But then, we started asking ourselves questions when we saw the president's tweet over the weekend. Now, it wasn't a directive per se. It said that the president didn't believe that Mueller should testify. Now, the Attorney General has indicated he has no problem with it. According to the committee, we haven't heard from Mueller, but according to the committee, they say that he's also indicated a willingness. But then you start asking yourselves, okay, this is the president's DOJ. Can he block Mueller from testifying? Now, there's no indication that those conversations are happening in any sense inside the White House right now. But that's the question.
Yeah,
can he block Mueller?
How will the public react?
How will the public react?
There are political downsides as well.
Absolutely. How would that look?
Well, that's a good question. And then the other question is, okay, can you block him while he's an employee of the Department of Justice? But then does that still carry when he's a private citizen? I don't know.
Well, that's why you have some Democrats on the committee. Remember Steve Cohen from Tennessee last week, who brought the fried chicken prop to the hearing. He's called for Mueller to resign from the Justice Department so that he can come freely as a private citizen. But I think one thing to keep in mind when we talk about the president and what he tweets and what he says, if we've learned anything from reading the Mueller report about this administration, it's that just because the president says something doesn't necessarily always make it so.
That's right. 5 of those officials, exactly.
Well, and then the question is also, the latest we've heard from Bill Barr is that he has no objection to Mueller testifying, and we haven't heard from him since the president's tweet. So is that still his position?
Do they agree? Disagree?
Do they agree?
Yeah.
Right. Nothing to suggest otherwise.
So we'll see as we march towards the 15th, which is the date that's been floated about. Finally, though, in this segment, we do need to just pay note of one other milestone in this incredible saga of the past 2 years. Today, the president's former personal attorney, Michael Cohen, reported to prison in New York State, in Otisville Penitentiary. Catherine, you've been doing some reporting on him. We saw he held a press conference right outside his home before being driven up 3 years behind bars for lying to Congress, among other things.
Yeah, lying to Congress and campaign finance violations. You can see him right there talking before reporting to jail. It's just important to remember that this is the president's longtime attorney for over 10 years who once said that he'd take a bullet for the president. Now he's heading to jail for lying to Congress and campaign finance violations. And right there in that press conference, he said that he hopes when he gets out of jail that the country will be in a place without xenophobia, injustice, and lies at the helm of our country, essentially saying that the man who he represented for 10 years that he'd take a bullet for, he hopes that he's not in office when he gets out of jail.
And that was his Escalade pulling up there, just if you were watching the video, to Otisville Penitentiary, where he will be spending his time for 3 years. Long time.
I was just going to say that it's also interesting timing that just last week the Speaker of the House accused the Attorney General of lying to Congress, and now we are watching Michael Cohen go to prison for, among other things, lying to Congress.
Catherine Falders, Ben Siegel, thank you both very much for that. Shifting gears yet again to a dramatic show of force overnight. Caught a lot of people by surprise. The White House announcing that they were deploying a carrier strike group and bomber task force to the Middle East to respond to what the National Security Advisor described, Mary Alice, as troubling and escalatory indications and warnings from Iran. This coming on the one-year anniversary of President Trump pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal.
And it's hard to see whether or not, hard to imagine that Iran would not interpret this move by the U.S. as being exploratory themselves. Is that a word? Is that the right word? It didn't come out right. As an escalation.
Escalatory. We're learning some new vocabulary now. Let's bring in our Pentagon reporter Louis Martinez to help us understand what that actually means. Because Louis, this was a bit of a stunner overnight, and it took you some time to track officials down, get some reporting on what was going on here. This strike group was already headed there, but there was in fact some real danger to our troops.
No, that's right, Devin. Real danger is what was being caught on U.S. intelligence. We're told by U.S. officials that sometime on Friday there was threat streams, as they call them, that were emerging from the Middle East, particularly about Iran or their proxy groups, either Hezbollah or the Houthis in Yemen, against targeting U.S. facilities, U.S. military personnel, either on land in Iraq and Syria or at sea. We have various U.S. Navy ships that are off there at the coast in the Middle East region at any given time. And so the U.S. Central Command Commander, General McKenzie, he drew up plans to push forward this carrier from the Mediterranean, where it had just arrived, and to push it into the Middle East waters, and also to send a bomber task force. That request was approved by the Acting Secretary of Defense, Patrick Shanahan, and then they drew up a statement. And what we understand is that statement was actually written, by General Joseph Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and was ultimately released by Ambassador John Bolton, who's a national security advisor. And you talked about that statement, right? Very strong language that the United States doesn't want war with Iran, but that it's going to protect its interests, whether it's attacked by Iran or any of its proxies. But a very stunning development, because we weren't seeing this at all emerging over the weekend, but obviously this was top-line focus for the U.S. military over the weekend.
Yeah, let's bring Colonel Steve Ganyard into this. It's our lucky day. Steve is around. He's already trotting around the world, meeting with our allies. Steve, great to see you. Glad we got lucky with you this afternoon. Give us your elevator analysis here of how dangerous the situation is. Could we be headed toward a real conflict with Iran?
Devin, I think it's prudent. Now, I'm a little suspicious of what intelligence drove this. Apparently, there's an Axios article out that I think is a bit overwritten that talks about the Mossad visiting the White House a couple weeks ago and drawing up some scenarios on how Iran might retaliate against the United States in the Persian Gulf. So Louis got some additional information there that they were hearing some things over the weekend. Obviously, diplomatic facilities throughout the region are soft spots, and the Iranians would not be stupid enough to directly attack the U.S. with Iranian military forces, but they would use their cutouts, their surrogates, the IRGC, the Quds Force. They'd make it look like it was a terrorist attack, find some sort of plausible deniability, and Secretary Pompeo and Mr. Bolton are saying, we see through that, and we're going to move significant force into the region because we believe if anything happens to any United States military or diplomatic personnel, that we think it'll be directly attributed to Tehran. And so moving a bomber task force, and this is catching them a little bit out of the rotation, but there's normally bombers deployed to the region. There's normally a carrier in the region, so they'll just move things up, and they're making a statement, and it should come out loud and clear to the Iranians.
Do you think that any other players in the region beyond Iran might respond to this kind of movement that we're seeing?
Well, the Iranians are fairly well isolated. The only country in the Persian Gulf that will even talk to them is Qatar and perhaps Oman. But the Saudis, the Emirates, the Bahrainis, the Kuwaitis are all sort of on the other side, figuratively and literally. And the U.S. Can expect, if not direct support, in any kind of a shooting incident. They would expect base support and things like that. So it's quite useful that the United States has now allied itself with most of the Persian Gulf, and it gives us opportunities that we didn't have just a few years ago.
And Louis, what was so fascinating about this movement to me also was the fact that it comes on the heels of two other escalations, if you will, if that's the word of the day. The United States, just a short time ago, obviously declared Iran's military a terrorist organization. We know that they cracked down on those sanctions for Iran's oil sales and distribution. I mean, does there come a point when all of these things together pushes Iran to a tipping point? Could we be making this more dangerous than it maybe needs to be?
Well, there's no doubt that those scenarios that you laid out have actually increased the pressure on Iran. We know that the economic situation in Iran is pretty bad right now. We know that those sanctions are having some effect. And like naming the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, as a terrorist organization was a big step. But it also led to a retaliatory step on the part of the Iranians, calling the United States military in the region a terrorist organization as well. So, ramping up the rhetoric, which could be par for the course. But you're right. I mean, having this kind of scenario play out where you now have gunboat diplomacy actually taking place could come at a tense time. And when you have, let's say, people under tense situations, government leaders under tense situations, it can be kind of difficult to predict exactly how they're going to react. But I think in this sense, the mission here is that the United States wants to send a message to Iran, particularly its leaders, particularly that the IRGC and its Quds Force, which just act independently sometimes of the leadership and the political leadership inside Iran. And so I think that's where the message is truly intended. But again, since those guys act as independent players sometimes, it can be very difficult to predict how they're going to react to something like this. And I think that unpredictability is something that U.S. officials are concerned about, especially if they're sending such a large force into the area.
Yeah, definitely worth keeping an eye on. Louis, we know you will do that for us from the Pentagon. Louis Martinez, thank you. Steve Ganyard, ABC News contributor, also joining us. Steve, thank you so much. Shifting gears now to a troubling new report on the global human impact on our climate and animal species, the ripple effects, quite something. This UN report out just in the past day or so is the most comprehensive look, we're told, at human impact on species, on the world. Look at this, though. The top line finding that's grabbing everyone's attention today is that in just a few decades, up to 1 million animal and plant species are at risk of extinction, in part because of climate change and other human impacts. And for more on this now, I want to bring in our friend and neighbor here, Dr. Enrique Salah from the National Geographic Society. He's the National Geographic Explorer in Residence. Dr. Salah,
cool
great to see you.
It's a cool title.
It's a very cool title. Also, we've got some pictures that we can show folks as well from your work preserving oceans and marine life. I want to start, though, with just asking you about this report and what's new here. What's your big takeaway from this UN study?
This report comes right time because we already know that we are destroying the natural world at an unprecedented rate, right? But we still have time to act. And people tend to see climate change in one silo, biodiversity, nature in another silo, oceans, food production, war, but it's all the same. The Earth is a one large living system and everything is connected. And what this report shows is that we have to stop destroying our life support system.
And there's a big connection between this mass extinction or the risk for mass extinction and protecting the oceans. We're seeing a lot of reports that about a limited biodiversity in the oceans and a lot of the extinctions taking place there. Talk to us about what lawmakers and foreign officials are doing to start addressing exactly that, and what else you think they should be doing.
Right now, only 5% of the ocean and 15% of the land is protected in protected areas, national parks. And the science is telling us that we need half of the planet in natural state and 30% of the planet in protected areas by 2030. Otherwise, the natural world, the ocean, the forests, the grasslands, will not be able to provide the oxygen we need, the food we need, the clean water we need to survive. Basically, half of the planet in natural state, and the milestone is 30%. About a third of the planet, land and ocean, in protected areas by 2030.
Wow, let's bring in Joe Walton into this conversation. He's the Vice President of Field Conservation Programs at the Wildlife Conservation Society. Pick up right where Dr. Salah was leaving off there. Joe, you work in preserving and creating these wildlife refuges and national parks and the like. How do we do that? How does the world come together to preserve 50% of Earth in natural state?
Well, the good thing is, as Enrique says, is that this is entirely possible, is that the world This report actually isn't a report of just biodiversity specialists. This report that's out here is a report of governments. And as such, it's those governments which have the responsibility now to take on this evidence to be able to make larger commitments around the Earth. And it's actually not that difficult to do. It's a huge, it's a challenge that faces us in the next few years. But one actually, if we get together, it's entirely possible to be able to not just stem the declines, but actually start to reverse them. And we have that available to us. As Enrique says, the connection between biodiversity and climate change is a very obvious and profound one. And you don't even have to worry or be that passionate about wildlife species like necessarily we are. You've only got to look to the fact that insurance companies, 34 central banks of the world, are now raising the flag of alerting us to the fact that this threat to biodiversity is undermining our economic systems, our agricultural systems, our water supply, our food security. And as such, that requires now united governmental response.
Joe, can you break that down one more level for us? I mean, just to help underscore that and help people understand. So, you know, this isn't just saving nature for nature's sake, if you will, but you're talking about economic systems. But in practical terms, what does that mean? If someone doesn't consider themselves an environmentalist, but what's the argument that you make that we do need to be preserving these things because the real human impact is there?
Sure. The first thing I think is to get clear is that this deep connection between biodiversity conservation and climate change. There is no replete response to climate change that does not involve the protection and security of biodiversity. And the more whether we cut down mangroves, we remove pollinators from the system, then the more we're damaging the most obvious, the cheapest, and the most effective natural response to climate change, which are natural rock forests, grasslands, coral reefs, seagrasses, and other natural systems. These ecosystems, they will, if left protected, if unadulterated by humans, they will actually regenerate and form the best defenses against what we're seeing, not just as, for instance, coastal defenses around where I live in New York and New Jersey, which are deeply threatened, again, by this flooding. We see all across the world now people in rich countries, in poor countries, being affected because biodiversity is no longer able to protect us in the face of climate change. So that's the first one. The second one is more of the systemic breakdown that's happening. Again, you know, we fail to often realize that some of the basic things, you know, we go and eat apples here in the US. 90% of them are pollinated by bees here, as in blueberries, cherries, all of our food products. They're still, however much we manufacture, they're still deeply reliant on biodiversity. And we've always assumed that they're going to be there. And those systems we're seeing through this report are now collapsing. And those and when it starts to hit our food systems and it hit our water systems, then that's when we've really got to start worrying as a globe rather than just as a bunch of wildlife conservationists sometimes.
Enrique, I want to ask you, in your experience, are there certain species that you're particularly worried about, or reading this report, certain species that you think could disappear quickly without the world's attention?
Well, we have already lost 90% of the large fish in the ocean, like the groupers, the tuna, the sharks. 90%? 90% because of fishing.
Grouper.
You better start changing your diet.
Start changing my diet.
But, you know, it's not just the species that we know about. Let's think about oxygen. Half of the oxygen we breathe is produced by microbes in the ocean, whose existence we didn't know until 30 years ago.
Wow.
You know, and we're talking about the Paris Climate Agreement and the climate goals. It will be impossible to achieve them as long as we continue cutting forest and grasslands and wetlands, peat bogs. These are the machines that absorb much of the CO2 that we expel in the atmosphere. We cannot do that. You know, if we had the capacity to produce all the oxygen that is in the atmosphere, that is produced by microbes and plants, it would cost us 1,600 times the global GDP.
Wow.
I mean, we cannot replace what nature does for us for free.
So not a lot we need to pay attention to. Dr. Enrique Salah, National Geographic Explorer. National Geographic, now part of the Disney family, so great to see you. We're also neighbors here in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much, for coming over. Really appreciate it. And also our thanks to Joe Walton with the Wildlife Conservation Society. Appreciate him as well. Finally today, a little bit of a lighter note just to kick off with here. The President is about to award the Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in this country, to Tiger Woods. We have established here in the briefing room that Mary Alice Parks is an esteemed golfer, so she can speak to his golfing skills, but he is someone that deserves the honor, Mary Alice, and it's closely watched. He's getting a solo presentation today.
I think it's really cool. I think he obviously has made history, and I think well-deserving.
All right, fun stuff. That will be carried live here at ABC News Live. Also, coming up shortly, John Karl's interview with Bernie Sanders, one of the Democratic frontrunners in 2020, which Mary Alice was out there with Bernie Sanders this weekend as well in Iowa. Stay tuned for that. Great to have you with us on this very busy Monday. Mary Alice Parks, I'm Devin Dwyer. We'll see you tomorrow, 3:30 here in the briefing room.